To EduSet Network. Friend, we have organized 2 lectures on public administration. The precise topic is inclusive governance. We would like to understand the meaning of inclusive governance and how it is being, how efforts are being made to make inclusive governance at the level of a state, market, and also at civil society. And for discussion on this very topic, we have in the studio Dr. Satish Jha. He teaches political science in Delhi University, and he has a good experience of teaching the public administration and also the knowledge of field administration. So it will help us to understand this topic in a new perspective. So on behalf, I welcome Dr. Jha for the lecture on inclusive governance. Welcome you, sir.
Thank you, Anjanji. In fact, today's topic for discussion, that inclusive governance, poses a set of problems to all of us, because inclusion is such thing which is implied in any discourse on development. Because when we talk of development in society, it has to be a broad-based discourse in which all sections of the society are not only included, but they also play active role in this endeavor. Now this exercise of development has been looked at from 2 different perspectives in social science. One comes from developmental economics, whereas the other has come from public administration. Now, public administration as a branch of political science, which in course of time has become an autonomous field for inquiry, autonomous field for research and reflection, has always dealt with this issue of relating state and state institutions with this process of development in society. Now it started with the Western liberal democracies, which were basically facing this problem of development, particularly economic development and social cohesion, and therefore public administration from the very beginning has been to some extent Eurocentric in terms of its focus. I mean, it took into account only the issues which the Western social systems were facing at that time. Now, public administration discourse starts with a very famous formulation which is associated with the name of Woodrow Wilson, which believes in a dictum called politics administration dichotomy. Now, this politics administration dichotomy implies that administration is a scientific enterprise. Therefore, there has to be a distance between politics and administration. The administrators have to maintain some sort of neutrality, impartiality, and for that they have to keep a distance with the political arena and the politicians, the practitioners of politics. Now, this dichotomy was considered to be crucial for both augmenting productivity as well as for effecting transition in the society towards a more prosperous and more egalitarian world order. Now, this perspective in public administration was a dominant perspective initially, but in 50s and 60s, certain other types of considerations entered, and that offered a powerful challenge to this dominant discourse of politics administration dichotomy. Now, what emerged in 50s and 60s in the discipline of public administration in West, and it took place in name of comparative public administration, when Asia, Africa, and Latin America witnessed a new type of upsurge when many countries became independent. Which came to be known as developing countries, the third world countries, and they were having a similar problem of development, and some of the states were trying to use the state machinery to basically, to start this process of economic development, growth, productivity, so on and so forth. So 50s and 60s, when public administration in the West found that the concern could no longer be limited only to the Western experience, but some of the third world experiences had to be incorporated in their theoretical framework, that led to new churning within this discipline of public administration, and this was in form of a new perspective emerging, and it was called comparative public administration. Now, comparative public administration in course of time graduated into a discourse of development administration, and some of the issues which it addressed, interestingly, without having theoretical resources coming from the branch of public administration, some of the developing countries had already embarked on that path of bringing this development in society through the instrumentality of state institutions. For example, it was the case of India under Nehru as our first prime minister, when we had a very a planned development with a planning process, with a planning commission at the helm of affairs, so on and so forth in 50s. So basically, public administration has traversed a long path from a period where politics administration dichotomy was a dominant perspective to the development administration discourse, which instead of talking of politics administration dichotomy started talking about bringing politics and administration together. That how in absence of a political vision, administration though may appear neutral, impartial, but some of the values, the social values, the cultural values which are required for development in society, those values may be missing, and therefore instead of creating this dichotomy between politics and administration, what is required is that the politics and administration should join hands, they should travel together. Rather, it should be three-legged race between politics and administration. So it is basically a new chapter in the entire discourse in name of development administration. And the slogan which was given was not only productivity and efficiency, but also equity, that how equity can be brought about in society, how diversity and harmony, social harmony, they can also be promoted through the instrument of administration. So I think that this was a new dimension added to this enterprise, and therefore I think that it became very important for the discipline of public administration that the third world experiences should also be incorporated in entire exercise of theorizing, understanding, and practicing this type of administration. Now, with this background, we have to see that how this discipline of public administration and the issues which were being debated in public administration impacted the actual problem of some of the countries in the world, particularly the third world countries. And we can discuss this issue with reference to India in a nice way, because much before these concerns entered into the public administration discourse in the West in 60s, I think India already had started its journey on this path of development administration, because there are two things. One is development of administration, another is administration for the purpose of development. Two have to go simultaneously, because if the entire development is dependent on the administration and its machinery, then simultaneously there has to be the development of administration as well. your administration should be, perfect. It should be, it should have the capability to undertake the responsibility, societal responsibility, the developmental responsibility. Therefore, the administrative development, the development of administration is equally important. As important is the question of, the role of administration in the development. So the two issues were basically troubling the policy makers in India in 50s, when India, particularly after 1947, when India got independence. Now, therefore, the first thing which was done by India's first Prime Minister Nehru was to initiate two type of processes. One is that, how to have this development going in society, and development at that time, of course, was interpreted in context of India as, growth centric development, productivity, because India at that time was characterized by a situation where there was a scarcity of resources. So basically the growth was the central focus, but how to have this growth in a society which didn't have infrastructure, which didn't have capital, adequate capital, which didn't have, a lot of things which are required for economic development, and therefore it was a big problem. So I think the multi-pronged strategy which was chalked out by Nehru at that time included not only the planning commission and the planning process, a centralized planning process which was being looked after by the Prime Minister. Extra constitutional body created by the resolution of the cabinet became a supra cabinet to some extent for many years. It enjoyed so much power that practically it was the planning commission which was overseeing all issues pertaining to development in India. So that was one. But at the same time, there was also a concern of mobilizing resources, and those resources were sought to be mobilized through number of ways, including, the trade, of course, in a limited way, through assistance from different countries, and therefore India's policy of non-alignment, the foreign policy, was also to some extent, part of this discourse in context of the Cold War politics, because by being non-aligned, India at least was in a position to seek assistance from both power blocs. And simultaneously, apart from this planning process, policy of non-alignment, there was also a focus on administrative reforms, because India had come out of the colonial structure, colonial, subjugation. Therefore, the focus was that how to have a very effective and efficient, responsive administration which will undertake all these responsibilities, because colonial administration was characterized by lack of responsiveness, because it was colonial rulers who were ruling the colonial subjects. But that was no longer the situation. India was a republic, and particularly in a democracy where ultimately the people's voice has to be heard. So therefore the administration has to be responsive. And secondly, administration in context of development administration, but the administration is not simply a revenue collector or law and order provider as it was being seen earlier in the colonial period. Now the administration was essentially meant to augment development. So therefore in this context, how to have a reform of administration. And this reform agenda was very significant at that time, because what happened that even when the constitution was being drafted in the Constituent Assembly, there was some sort of debate between Nehru and Patel, India's first Home Minister, India's first Prime Minister, and both of them debated this issue, that what to do with the colonial administration. Nehru, as a Democrat, he believed that since India is going to have democracy, parliamentary form of democracy, this colonial administration should have no place in this type of setup. Therefore, we should think in terms of having some democratic institution, some democratic apparatus through which this work could be done. On the other hand, Patel, as a more pragmatic and more realist in this sense, thought that because India was suffering from a lot of problems at that time, the partition politics was already there, which had taken a heavy toll of our resources, our social cohesion and so on and so forth. Therefore, he thought that it would not be possible for India to switch over to any new mode of administration, and therefore he suggested that we should continue and carry with the colonial administration, and finally it was Patel who prevailed. And subsequently we find that in spite of initial reservations of Nehru about this administrative machinery, subsequently we find that Nehru himself became quite comfortable with this administrative machinery and tried to use this machinery for the developmental goal. And therefore, when this planning commission was established, what we find that Nehru, of course, presided over this planning commission, but nonetheless handed over the entire policy formulation to this bureaucracy, which at one point of time he thought would not be able to discharge this duty. But at the same time, in all fairness to Nehru, he also realized at the same time that the problems might emerge in a democracy like India, because this administration, which was a colonial legacy, earlier it was known as ICS, Indian Civil Service, subsequent version, later on after independence it came to be known as IAS. He thought that this administrative machinery may not be as democratic as perhaps the Indian people might expect them to be, and therefore certain other measures were also required to to create more avenues for participation and representation of people in this endeavor, collective endeavor called development, because development can't be visualized where different sections of society fail to participate in it. Therefore, what we find that in 50s, apart from the planning commission as a supra cabinet, as a centralized monolithic structure overseeing the entire developmental process in the entire country, what we find that in 50s Nehru also initiates certain other measures which are equally significant, and those measures were like community development program, the measures like cooperative movement, and subsequently this community development program turning into a move for Panchayati Raj institutions for participation of people and decentralization and devolution of power. So I think that multi-pronged strategies were chalked out in 50s to have a kind of situation where administration and development both go hand in hand, and where the people's participation and the representation are also sought, and exclusion is reduced, exclusion of any sort, exclusion, either political exclusion or social exclusion or economic exclusion. So therefore, an inclusive discourse was basically sought to be institutionalized through these measures of Panchayati Raj, cooperative movement, community development program, planning commission, and number of other measures which were taken on behalf of the Indian state. So this is how the 50s went on in context of India, when the public administration in the West was debating this issue, that how this public politics administration dichotomy should be totally abandoned, and we should think of having a new framework, which subsequently in 60s came to be known as development administration or comparative public administration, 50s and 60s. So what is more significant about India and countries like India, that here these concerns emerged out of their practical experience, whereas in the public administration discipline, which I mentioned initially, was Western centric discourse at that time, these concerns entered after they observed what was happening in newly independent nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and therefore when they ran into trouble, their framework ran into trouble, they thought that it required some modifications and new concerns have to be brought into this discipline. So I think there is a difference here in terms of the situational logic, because in India this emerges at a practical problem, the problem emerging in context of the attempt of the policy makers, the politicians, the the state to deal with this situation. So 50s went on like this. Now 60s, late 60s, it was realized that whatever was attempted in name of this development discourse, which at that time was, popularly, even today it's popularly remembered as Nehru-Mahalanobis model of development. Now, it was realized that this developmental strategy had certain limitations, and therefore, in order to focus on productivity and on growth, certain key issues were sidestepped, and therefore they required some rectification. So 60s, what we find, when number of problems came up, after 15 or 16 years of the experience, what we find that you have number of turbulences, you had number of discontents surfacing in the society, and therefore late 60s and early 70s, because of this realization, certain new thinking emerged. Now this new thinking was no longer confined to this issue of only growth and productivity, but new thinking also try to include within its purview the issues pertaining to redistribution. That growth is one thing in development, but growth in itself may not lead to to a situation where different sections of the society would be included in it. Rather, it sometimes might lead to exclusion. And it was realized that in 50s and early 60s, what happened in name of growth, certain big business interests monopolized the Indian economy, because Indian economy from the very beginning relied on a principle which was called mixed economy, where the public and private partnership, where the public or the state would be playing a role of what was called the commanding height. I mean, all major initiatives for the infrastructure and other sectors would be taken by the state, and the private would be only lending a supporting hand. Now, this was interpreted, to have at that time that this, framework turned into a situation where the big business interests monopolized, the Indian economy, and the net beneficiary of the entire thing was, the big business of India. Business, bureaucracy, and politics, the partnership between the three led to a situation where more and more people were being excluded. And therefore, it was realized that the 60s, whatever discontent was observed in society was largely due to this kind of exclusion. And therefore, a new strategy was chalked out. And this new strategy came to be known as a strategy of redistribution. That not only production, but also redistribution. Because how the people should feel more empowered, both in terms of politics and both in terms of economy. So new strategy, which was associated with the name of the Prime Minister Indira Gandhi at that time, when she gave the slogan on the one hand of the Garibi Hatao, eradication of poverty, but at the same time also gave the slogan for more proactive role of the state. So a state on the one hand tried to curb the activities of the unbridled private capital in India, the big business. On the other hand, she also tried to take this redistributional initiative to a more proactive form. For example, the nationalization of banks, and then enactment of number of laws and acts at that time were basically symptomatic of this type of framework of governance in the hands of Mrs. Gandhi. For example, MRTP, Monopoly Trade Restriction Act, and similar other measures, that how the monopolies from the market should be abolished. Certain houses which were monopolizing the resources, that should be curbed on behalf of the state. So I think these initiatives on the one hand try to curb the ascendancy and the dominance of certain handful of big horses on Indian economy, but on the other hand it led to a situation where a state and a state administration, state agencies like bureaucracy became more and more ascendant and dominant. So much so that this era was characterized as the era of license permit Raj. I mean, the state started not only curbing the monopolies, but started distributing licenses and permits for every economic activity in such a way that it was characterized as license permit Raj. To the extent that subsequently, when in 90s Indian economy was liberalized and a new discourse started, which we will discuss later, I think license permit Raj was in fact considered to be the sole factor responsible for a stagnant India's economic situation. So therefore, the 60s and 70s went like this: focus on redistribution, trying to understand the limitations of the growth-centric discourse of Nehru, and then trying to also, to curb the monopolies of big business, big capital in India, at the same time trying to include people, of course, through more populist slogans like Garibi Hatao and so on and so forth. So this inclusion, the slogan of Garibi Hatao at that time appealed to the people, and therefore the landslide victory for Mrs. Gandhi in 1971. But nonetheless, it turned out to be a populist rhetoric, because in practice people thought that nothing much could be done in name of such slogans. So 70s went on like this, but the overall situation in the country did not improve much. And on the other hand, this was on the development front, but on the administration front, in the 50s, as I mentioned earlier, that in spite of the initial reservations of Nehru about Indian administration, where he wanted to make it more democratic, and therefore he had a debate with the Patel, and when finally he didn't succeed in that, then he tried to work with the same administration and rather empowered this administration in such a way that lot of centralizing tendencies developed due to the planning process, which was perhaps the brainchild of Nehru and his favorite discourse. But at the same time, this administration, he had also wanted to do certain corrective measures to reform this administration, and therefore in 50s, I mean in 52, 53, he invited the American expert, the consultant Paul Appleby, to come and review the performance of Indian administration. And Appleby report became very significant in the 50s, because Appleby suggested number of measures, and some of them, of course, Nehru accepted, including the one which led to the establishment of Indian Institute of Public Administration. But at the same time, this Appleby the report was sought by Nehru to just make the existing administration, which at that time was a legacy of the colonial administration, more effective, more conducive for the developmental purpose. Now, apart from this Appleby, there were other attempts also at administrative reform, because I told you that the two things have to go simultaneously. If it is a development administration, then administration has to play important role for development, and therefore administration has to continuously grow. But at the same time, the development also has to be reviewed, that in what way the targeted goal is being achieved or not. So two things were being done simultaneously. And therefore, what you find that apart from Appleby report, the second plan document, you find that a whole chapter is being devoted on administrative reform, the capability of administration, that how administration is important for development, and so on and so forth. So all these things were happening around this Nehru-Mahalanobis model discourse of development. Focus on administration continued in 60s, so much so that Administrative Reforms Commission was formed, led by no other person than Morarji Desai. Of course, he resigned, and then he was succeeded by someone else. But the thing is that Administrative Reforms Commission, formation of this Administrative Reforms Commission in 60s, late 60s, was basically pointed to the same fact, that the Indian state was continuing with this discourse of reforming administration. Now, apart from Administrative Reforms Commission and Appleby, there were many minor and major attempts going on at the same time at department level, at ministry level, at different levels. So 50s and 60s, the administration and administrative reforms were also on the agenda. So on the one hand, from growth to redistribution, on the other hand, from colonial administration to more democratic and developmental administration, the two discourses were running on the parallel lines. Now 70s went on like this. The 80s was a new, chapter in the entire history of our developmental politics. Because 80s, what happens that when Mrs. Gandhi comes back to power in 1980, later on we find that she herself initiates this process of liberalization, which of course is associated with the name of her son Rajiv Gandhi after 85, and more particularly Narasimha Rao Manmohan Singh government of 1991 onwards. But it was the 80s. I mean, when Mrs. Gandhi came back to power, we find that some indications are coming that the Indian state was trying to have a rethinking about the entire strategy of development which they had undertaken earlier. But 85, after landslide victory in 1985, Rajiv Gandhi, in order to modernize India, in order to make India more technology friendly, in order to augment the growth, etc. and etc., he tried a massive, liberalization of Indian economy, and under that initiative you had technology, new brands of technology being imported, new initiatives being taken in the budgetary allocations, a lot of new incentives, a lot of new initiatives were announced, and so basically 80s started on this note. But 90s, the dawn of 90s, it starts with a big problem, and that starts with a gloom. Internationally, of course, it is very significant because of number of issues. It is significant because of the end of Cold War, the Gulf crisis, which led to a lot of problems for many economies, including India. But for India, I think that 90s is significant because of the crisis of 1991, and it was a balance of payment crisis, crisis of foreign exchange. And that led to, for the first time, the government initiating series of measures under the directive of World Bank and IMF, because India had to go to World Bank and IMF for assistance. And in order to give assistance, they imposed certain conditionalities, which India had to abide by those conditionalities. And because of that, a new chapter is added into the entire discourse. And this is known as era of liberalization, privatization, and also structural adjustment. Because IMF and World Bank, while giving assistance to India, made it mandatory that Indian state would initiate certain reforms within the economy, and the reforms would be in nature of liberalization. It will be in nature of structural adjustment, cut on the fiscal deficits, changes in monetary policies, and so on and so forth. So basically, under the compulsion, Indian state initiates series of reforms, and 90s economic reforms, which is known as era of economic reforms, were basically part of this larger discourse of IMF and World Bank. Now this is how the Indian entire discourse of developmental administration, or India's discourse of development, got tagged to these multilateral agencies like IMF and World Bank, which for the first time started calling the shots in the Indian economy. Because otherwise earlier, in name of non-alignment, in name of many other things, in order to keep our autonomy, our sovereignty, so on and so forth, we try to insulate ourselves from these agencies in the Cold War era. But around this time, when India landed into trouble and there was no other way, India had to basically fall in line with the prescriptions which were being offered by these agencies like World Bank and IMF. Now, having said this, one thing is also to be remembered, that what IMF and World Bank were doing to India was not totally new thing. They had already experimented it in context of the sub-Saharan Africa in 89, and therefore this discourse was prevalent in the IMF World Bank circuit, particularly in context of Africa and Latin America, and this was called at that time as a neoliberal policies, neoliberal discourse, which privileges market over the state, less of a state and more of a market, in name of free enterprises, encouraging and promoting free enterprises, rather celebrating market mechanism. So this was something which was prevalent in certain other parts of the world, and IMF and World Bank tried to basically push the same prescription in case of India as well. Now this thing also has a context, and that goes to the American economy, the crisis in 70s, the OPEC crisis, and so on and so forth. Then finally how the United States of America handed over some of the crisis situations of Africa and Latin America to IMF, and then how this structural adjustment program was initiated, but that is a separate story. Now what I am trying to mention here, that 90s, because of the IMF World Bank prescriptions, India entered into a new period, new era of its developmental discourse. On this era, as I told you, that popularly known as in political economy circles, it is known as neoliberal policies. Neoliberal policies have certain characteristics, and one of the most important characteristic is that rolling back the state, withdrawing the state, because in India what we have seen that under Nehru Mahalanobis model, and subsequently even the corrective measures were being taken in 60s in name of redistribution, but there was no getting away from this state centric growth. So basically state was at the helm of affairs, it had a commanding height, as it was called then, and therefore the state was being asked to roll back in the new neoliberal under the new neoliberal ideology of IMF and World Bank. So I think this was for the first time that Indian strategy had to be radically and fundamentally altered, which had never been done earlier. So what we find that 90s starts with the new situation, the new discourse, the new initiatives, and Narasimha Rao as India's Prime Minister and Manmohan Singh as his Finance Minister were basically the key players in the entire strategy. So 90s we have massive liberalization of economy, you have a structural adjustment program, you had public sector enterprises being cut to sizes, it was being downsized, you had the massive cut on public investment, you have the initiatives to private enterprises, private investment, and to some extent one can say the celebration of the market. So 90s, number of initiatives, number of strategies being chalked out to basically institutionalize this new discourse which was being suggested by the IMF and the World Bank, which is called neoliberal ideology, neoliberal discourse. Now in the meanwhile, the World Bank and IMF started also reflecting on this issue, because now it was no longer the case of only Latin America and African, sub-Saharan Africa, but now it was a context of some countries like India, which at that time was visualized as going to be a major economic force in times to come. Therefore there was a rethinking at their own policy formulation level, and they started debating this issue, and therefore they came out with number of perspectives on this issue in 90s. But 1997 I think is very significant, because 1997 they came out with a very definite definition of governance, because now what we find that earlier this public administration was dealing with government. When we talked of development, we talked of governmental initiative. Now for the first time we find that there is a semantic shift, and the shift is from government to governance, And this is something very significant, because what is the difference between government and governance? Because now the World Bank in 97 in its report came out powerfully saying that now the focus should be on governance, good governance, and the assistance to the countries who are basically desirous of help from the World Bank and IMF would be based on their performance of governance. So what is the good governance, what is the bad governance? These issues came into circulation. Now, number one, what is difference between government and governance? Because earlier we were dealing with the government, but all of a sudden we are being asked to think in terms of governance. Now the government, when we government was being was in the focus was only on state institutions, the agencies of the state, the traditional view of the state, legislature, executive, judiciary, and so on and so forth, civil services. But when we moved from government to governance, now it became slightly more broad in terms of its focus, because here now it was not only the governmental agencies, but it also include the market and agencies, market and its agencies, and also civil society and its agencies. So now the governance implied three things: state and its agencies, market and its agencies, and civil society and its agencies. And therefore World Bank now tried to define development with reference to this framework of governance, that how three things are being harmonized in any country: the state, the market, and the civil society. And this is perhaps the most crucial aspect in the entire thing. This is the turning point, because we find then onwards that this discourse of development is taking a new turn, with focus now not simply on state, but focus shifting to market as well as the civil society. Now the 97 report of the World Bank led to a situation where not only in the countries of Africa and Latin America, but India also, we had this governance agenda coming to the fore. Now 1991, already I told you that the reform climate had been already prepared, because certain conditionalities and because of certain other crisis situation which we were dealing with. And therefore the debate was basically centering around two issues in India. One was the failure of planned strategy, and number two was that impediments to this plan development because of the colonial bureaucracy. So how to deal with these two situations was already there. Now this impediment which was being put by the colonial bureaucracy, the solution was being given that states should be downsized, and more and more activities should be handed over to the market and the market forces, to the private players. And in other words, one can say the privatization was considered or was being suggested as an alternative to this problem. Now in terms of the failure of planned development, it was being thought that because of over centralization this thing is being done, and therefore the solution lies in devolution of power and decentralization. So these two problems and the two remedies were already on the agenda at that time. So what we find, that on the one hand, downsizing the state and giving more and more initiative to the market, and therefore what we find that on the one hand the privatization, liberalization were going on along with the globalization, which all coincided with these things after 1991. On the other hand, what we find that downsizing, this failure of the planned development led to a new thinking that devolution of power and decentralization perhaps were the remedies. So what we find that now, in a true sense, a Panchayati Raj institutions, decentralization of power was being thought of at that time. Now decentralization of power was not something new to India. I mentioned that even in 50s, when Nehru Mahalanobis model of development tried to take India to new heights when it decided to initiate a strategy of development which would be inclusive in their opinion, and then when they discovered that it was not being as inclusive as they perhaps expected it to be, then they chalked out some alternative strategies, and as part of that you had the cooperative movement, community development program, and Panchayati Raj, Balwant Rai committee report, and so on and so forth. That was the first generation. Even in 70s, the second generation reforms on Panchayati Raj, you had the Ashok Mehta committee, and then you have in the third generation at a regional level, you had the Karnataka experience, you had this Andhra experience, you had the Bengal experience of Panchayati Raj institutions. But all these things were being done. But 90s starts. 90s we have altogether a new situation where constitutional amendments are being done, and this devolution and decentralization discourse is being taken to new height. So you have the 73rd and 74th amendment of the constitution in 1993, Panchayati Raj and Nagar Palikas, municipalities, the real power to the people, that in order to eradicate the bottlenecks being created by colonial hangover of Indian bureaucracy and administration, let's involve the people. Let them make a fellow traveler in this enterprise. Make it a more participatory growth and more participatory development. And in other words, make it more inclusive. More and more people should feel included and represented. So therefore, the only way to do it is to decentralize it. And this was also in line with what the World Bank and IMF had already started believing and telling to the countries which had taken assistance from them, including India. So I think this harmonizes nicely with the donor agencies, thinking, and it also perhaps addressed some of the concerns which were emerging at the domestic level. So what happened, that 73rd and 74th amendment being done to Indian Constitution, Panchayati Raj institutions are being given a new life in India. Now what happened, that at the same time the planning process, which was also becoming issue for debate, because it was considered to be the failure of planned strategy, planned development. Therefore one alternative was to give more space to market and the private players, but at the same time how to make this planning also more effective. And therefore what happened, that this planning also started having a new thinking on number of issues. One was the people's involvement in development, another was the role of voluntary agencies and Panchayati Raj institutions and the cooperatives, and the third was restructuring of the public sector units, because public sector units were becoming kind of a burden on the public exchequer. So 8th 5-year plan, that was 92 to 97, in fact this debate on government and planning occupied a major part of this plan document. Now whereas on the second and third plan document I mentioned that the focus was on administration and its reforms, now the focus totally shifted in the new situation. The new situation was that how to make it more participatory, how to downsize the state, how to public sector, sick public sector units, even otherwise the public sector units should be downsized. So all these things were going on within the framework of planning as well. On the one hand, the attack on the planning, focus more on the budgetary allocations. On the other hand, attempt to bring in the private players, celebrate market, initiate market mechanism, and get rid of planning. But at the same time, within planning, the shift was in direction of making a more decentralized, people-friendly, participatory, planned strategy. And therefore you have a new space being created for voluntary organizations, voluntary agencies, which is popularly known in India as non-NGOs, non-governmental organizations. Of course, this started much earlier, 80s during Rajiv Gandhi's time, but 90s it acquires a new height. So now what happened, that National Human Development Report of the Planning Commission comes with an agenda and that agenda itself is suggestive. The agenda is devolution of power. Civil service reforms, incentive and disincentive incentives, procedural reforms, and finally empowerment, both women and the excluded sections like scheduled castes and the scheduled tribes. So now what happened that number one, the devolution and decentralization, and number two, the issue of addressing the exclusion, the issue of exclusion, which was always there from the very beginning, and strategies were chalked out, but some of them succeeded, but many of them failed. So now there is a new thinking, because earlier the exclusion was largely due to preponderance of a state, but now in the new situation where there were three important players in the entire discourse, because earlier it was mainly the state-centric development. Now development, first of all the government turned into governance, and the development itself became not one monocentric, monolithic structure, but rather it included three important agencies. One was the state, other was the market, and the third was the civil society. So therefore, exclusion at three levels have to be addressed now. Not only at one level, the level of a state, which was being done earlier, that people are being excluded from a state, therefore let's include them. Now, for example, the entire strategy of redistribution in 70s of Mrs. Indira Gandhi, Garibi Hatao, and this nationalization of banks and etc., was meant to include more and more people in governmental and the state-centric development. But now the inclusion had to be addressed at three levels of a state, market, and civil society, because it was believed that now these three agencies are the key players. Therefore, the exclusion can also happen at three levels. It can happen at the level of state, it can happen at the level of market, it can happen at the level of civil society. So what are the remedies, what are the preventives, what are the measures which are required to control this exclusion and make it more inclusive governance? That governance means that each and every member of the society, every group, every individual should feel as a fellow traveler, as a partner, as a participant in this enterprise. So therefore, now measures are being thought of to deal with exclusion at level of state, market, and civil society, and those measures become very significant for understanding this inclusive governance in India, which started in late 90s and particularly in 2000, when we had number of amendments and enactments, from right to education, right to information. You had a strategy of employment guarantee scheme like NREGA, this Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, to the bill for tribal rights, food security, etc. and etc. So basically, number of amendments and enactments, discourse acquiring form of a right discourse, not only simply in terms of commitment of the state, but is basically people are being empowered in terms of their rights, that they are part of their constitutional rights. So this inclusive discourse, inclusive governance is being given a constitutional shape now, shape of a constitutional right in India. So that is very important. Now, what are the means and what are the mechanisms through which the exclusions at three levels of state, civil society, and market have been tried to be tackled? That is something I think we will discuss in our next lecture, that is tomorrow.
Right. So these things in principle fine, but do you think that in practice could it be possible, or it will have to cross a major obstacles, as we generally notice while doing any welfare activities or welfare work by the administration or by the governments? How do you feel?
Yeah, very true. In fact, what happens that once we set out to operationalize certain framework of governance, and only after some time we realize the fallacies of that strategy.
Okay.
Now, 50s, as we have seen, that when Nehru started this entire strategy, he also thought that perhaps it will be inclusive governance. though this term governance may not have been in circulation at that time, but I think this governmental strategy was for the good governance and inclusion.
And the governance itself carries the connotation that will include all the people. It's not for a particular
only
sector or the
very
section
true.
of the people.
So, but what happened just before our own eyes, that finally Nehru himself realized, and subsequently many people realized, that it only succeeded in catering to the needs of the elites of the society. So what he thought of inclusion, it included only handful of people who were more resourceful, more privileged in the society. So it was elite centric discourse. 60s correctives were thought of in name of the populist slogan, Garibi Hatao and other things.
Right.
But end result was your license permit Raj. Rather, it empowered the state bureaucracy more than perhaps what Nehru had done.
Right.
So basically 90s, in name of empowering market, we are trying to curb state and we want to empower market. But now what is happening, we'll discuss tomorrow, that this corruptions in the corporate world, now what is we are witnessing.
More apparent than
people are facing, the pain of this new version of, exclusion. It's a totally exclusive, exclusionary policies, when in name of corporatization and market celebration of market mechanism, you find the corporate world not only monopolizing the resources, but basically frittering away the resources.
Yes, true.
So basically now we are realizing, and therefore it is being realized, that market can also lead to exclusion, not only a state.
Right.
So how to regulate market? How to have independent regulatory agencies? Now we will discuss tomorrow that entire movement within civil society for more accountability, whether it is through anti-corruption crusade of Anna Hazare and others, which is known as civil society movement, or many other uprisings or protests which are going all over India. They are the symptom of the same thing. So now we have already started realizing and seeing the policies of even this strategy, which we started in 90s to get rid of the problems of 50s, 60s and 70s.
Right.
So new strategy also done to be foolproof. But the thing is that how to deal with it.
So can we say, though we should not be pessimistic, but can we say that the one strategy replaces another one? One explanation replaces the another explanation. So this is just a kind of academic satisfaction that to explain something and put into the place. They are they are devoid of even iota of solution, we can say.
No, in fact, one cannot say that these things are only for academic consumption, because some of the things which we are debating and discussing here, I think they have grown out of the interaction between academics and the policy making process.
Right.
And they have been institutionalized. You had the entire cooperative movement, had a community development program, the Panchayati Raj institutions. Even today, what is happening through the enactments of NREGA or RTI or many other initiatives in order to empower people.
But when we look at the things, so these are the not the solution. This is a stopgap arrangement, whether it's RTI or whether whatever NREGA or etc. Governance itself promises. Okay, we'll have this.
Hello.
Before that, we take a question. Please ask your question. Disconnected. So we can say this is the stopgap arrangement. This does not address the entire problem and provide a solution which can be. And though it's true that any solution cannot be the full solution or the last solutions.
Yeah, in fact, to some extent, yes, I agree with you. But the thing is that in such situation or in such enterprises like development, no a priori solution can be thought of. Some of the basic principles you can only decide.
Is it because of the constraint of human mind? Yeah, we are not making endeavor to find it out.
No, because of richness of situation. The situation.
Like, see, RTI. one decade people fought for the RTI. Now this decade witnessing Lokayuk, General Lokpal will, etc. Another decade will come that will fight for another law. So we are not just thinking of getting more and more law. The people want solution. People want elixir of from the problems. So where that lies
You see,
and how
in
it
fact,
could be churned out.
yeah, basically there is no quick fix in this situation.
Right.
The problem is that in such situations we have to experiment.
Let us take a question from our viewers. Please ask your question. I think system is something. Okay, what were you?
I was telling that there is no quick fix. The only thing is that the solution has to come out of our practical experience. When you encounter problem,
Okay.
then we come out with the remedies, right? Whatever solutions you find today, apart from what World Bank and IMF have suggested,
Right.
what are some of the things which are also our own thinking on the issue, and this has come out of the people's engagement with the problem, people's engagement. Now when I say people, may not be the entire society, maybe the elites among them, maybe the more knowledgeable people, maybe the non-governmental organizations, maybe some some of their leaders, but nonetheless it is engagement. When they discover in context of their day-to-day problem that this is one of the major malady of this situation, then they come out with a suggestion, and then the rethinking starts. So I think that it is now picking up. It is still too early to say that whether these measures will be foolproof or not, because one problem we are already witnessing, that these remedies which are being suggested, they do not harmonize nicely with democracy.
No, your argument.
Because
your argument is fine. What you are suggesting, that is fine. But then when general masses can observe something
experts
and they
and masses,
provide
what is the difference? This is
what
your
is
question.
different? Yes, and visionary. We need a visionary leader, yeah, who can visualize the things 10 years from hence.
Right.
The-
Now the difference is like this: that masses can only tell you the problems they are encountering. They will not be able to tell you the exact remedies, right? Now the visionaries have to think about remedies. Problem, because after all this governance is the two-way process.
Right.
The civil society state mainly interaction. So you have to take the inputs from the people, that whatever you are doing, how they are responding to it, and their inputs have to be turned into a policy framework. And here lies the vision, that how you turn into more imaginative remedies, right, which is not only short term solution, but has a longer life, right? And some of them even become part of your institutions, formal institutions of society.
Okay. So well, friends, today we tried to know the basic concept of inclusive governance and how it has been evolved over the years, and we will continue our discussion on this very topic tomorrow. And the same resource person, Dr. Satish Jha, will be available with us for discussion on this very topic. Today we will like to conclude the lecture. I thank all of you for watching the lecture.